telling everybody that I government is shady. But every time I do, my family thinks I'm crazy. The hollow earth, UFOs, aliens invading. Fluoride in the water, they swear skies daily. When I talk about these things, they think I'm crazy. There's no escaping anymore the evil that we're facing. Illuminati mind control, they're sacrificing babies. The end of days, but anyways, my family thinks I'm crazy.
That I'm crazy. They really think that I'm crazy. They really think that I'm crazy. My family thinks that I'm crazy.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, here we are back again on the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast, and I am stoked to have this gentleman here with me today. You may know him as Analog. He also goes by the name The Archivist, and he is on YouTube and soon to be on Substack. You've seen him. He's done 3 excellent conversations with Greg Carlwood, a friend of this show, on the Higher Side Chats, and I am excited to have him here today. Him and I have talked briefly before with Dr. Longo, I think on Longo's channel, talking about the occult origins of golf. But I want to have Ben here on to talk about his story and his research because it's so unique and really well sourced too. So, Ben, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you here. For the audience who might not have heard of you before, just give us a quick lowdown on who you are and what you do.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Mark. I'm a husband and a father of 3 young boys, and a full-time researcher, so to say, or rememberer, as I kind of like to call it. Tell an old story, but to say quickly, in 2007, I had a motorcycle accident, and could have easily lost my life and been paralyzed. And during the accident, I had an out-of-body experience. And during the long recovery process from the accident, I became heavily obsessed with kind of understanding the OBE and the near-death experience and the similarities that existed between different people. And there was a lot of material on the subject, so I was pretty surprised. And I came across a book called Proof of Heaven. A doctor got a infection in his brain. He died several times. He experienced similar things to what I had experienced, and basically everyone was telling him that he was just hallucinating. That's normal, but he felt compelled to dedicate the next few years of his life to prove that it wasn't a hallucination and that it was real. And the Proof of Heaven was kind of the culmination of his efforts. And from there, I just became obsessed with consciousness, understanding what this human experience is, how it all works, as close as you can get to understanding all of that. Of course, that is an individual process, but through that, it kickstarted everything. It was kind of the fork in the road for me. And here we are today. What is that? A long time ago, almost 20 years ago. So
now, do you think the near-death experience kind of shook loose latent aspects of yourself? Were there parts of you that explored these ideas when you were younger, or does it feel like this was a big turning point in your life where now all these new ideas came to the forefront?
Oh, that was definitely a fork of the road. I'd always kind of been a bit of a maverick when it came to fitting into the world. I always kind of stick to that. I'm very much kind of a Cancer in that aspect. When it comes to astrology, I feel like I am that type of, I like to learn things on my own. I don't take things at face value. The subject matter is really what changed, and that would be the fork in the road. I always kind of lived my own life and thought my own ways and was very analytical, but again, the subject changed. The focus was altered drastically in that event and has led me into this kind of rabbit hole um, of information and obsessions with information, you know. So yeah, I've always been an avid reader, history, culture, religion. Um, but yeah, that was a big turning point.
Wow. Yeah, and anytime these sorts of tragedies happen, they come with gifts. As crazy as that may sound, you know, I've heard it before on the show. You're not the first guest to have a near-death experience and have a major life change. And I know you're working on a book. That's awesome. That's something that I remember. I think Howdy Mikowski had a similar experience where he had a near-death experience and then started writing and getting into all this material. So just very, very interesting. I think worth noting. You know, I'm sure many people can relate. I never had a near death experience, but I've come close, and I can certainly relate to the cancer side. I'm a Cancer moon. Not to get all girly on you, but when it comes to your work and specifically your modus operandi is to go into the archives, newspaper archives, and see what's been kind of left out of the record. Was this kind of like something that dawned on you while you were in recovery? Like, oh, what? Because there was a part of your story that was really interesting to me. You were trying to retrace the steps of your own life with the
Mhm.
newspaper archives. So where did
Yep.
that click into like, oh, okay, now let me see what's really happening with the country or with this state or with this, area?
Yeah. Again, I'll be quick with the synopsis because I've told the story before. But for your listeners, I found a pipe bomb on my middle school when I was young, and it was in the newspapers. The bomb squad came, they blew it up, they did a little report, and we had the original clipping on the fridge for years and years and years. And then who knows? My mom got a new fridge or remodeled the kitchen or something. We lost it. So I was telling this story probably in my early 20s, maybe late teens, and I ended up having to retrace the archives of my county, um, my state archive, to find the article. Um, and through that process, realized, wow, I can look all the way to the back to the very first newspaper of Oregon as a state, and even before then, Oregon was a very large territory encompassing Idaho and Nevada, and they had some papers that were very interesting. You could pick up the Oregon Territory papers they had, which there weren't very many, and they're very fragile. So the way they went about archiving them was at a different process. They were hard to read, but the things that people were writing about were, like biblical views, plots of land sold, mining claims. It was very generic. It wasn't not at all like we think of media today. It was completely related to how people were living their lives day to day. But yeah, so again, coming full circle, I had always kept that in the back of my mind and knew eventually through digitization, because this is all kind of photocopies, very, very archaic photocopies, not like the digitizations we have now. And you're using these rudimentary systems of viewing these large photocopies where they were like to scale, basically. So you had these huge machines. Anyways, what kind of led me into the online realm and taking my research into a forum-based environment where I was discussing a lot of my research with other individuals. I had made friends with A.S.C.E.T.I and another one of my friends, Victor, who's from Denmark. And through their friendship, I started kind of connecting my own research with a lot of people from around the world, and really found a love in actually creating relationships with people based on these similar thoughts and correlations and questions. I kept coming back to timelines, buried history, revisionist history, and that things for all across the realm, religion, culture, politics, were all kind of adapted and rewritten and changed quite drastically, especially in the early 1800s, back through the 12th century even. Anyways, so I ended up building a really good friendship with Victor. I co-hosted probably a dozen episodes of a radio show called Radio Tartaria. This is in 2019, 2018. So quite a long time ago, before Tartaria had kind of exploded. I'd say Victor was a big leading factor in that, as was Andreas, but Victor was a big archive guy. That's what brought us together. Was he had been archive diving European archives, and I had been doing the same thing in the American archives. Due to VPN and access stuff, Danish archives, obviously, again, the language barrier, but a lot of the VPN stuff is blocked if you're not a primary resident. So yeah, anyways, we made a friendship and we kind of started collabing on work, and it led me into this environment where I've made all these friends over the years and developed a way of kind of putting my own voice and spin and look on these historical matters, and that's what the archivist is. And yeah, my office looks a lot like yours. Hundreds of books. That's where it started. It was all analog. That's where the name came from. I started, my main obsession after that accident was buying books. I was collecting hundreds and hundreds of books. And then through, having children and a full-time job and family, the digital archive became my favorite because I could nail out exactly what I wanted through a wide array of content and really find what I was feeling in my gut as far as pertaining to a particular topic. So that's kind of where the channel went as far as the archives and the newspapers. I've been posting newspapers for almost 10 years, a little bit longer than that, actually, I think now. But making it like a full kind of focus as far as content is a relatively new venture.
It's a whole different landscape, and it's really exciting. When I first learned about your work, I immediately became jealous and was like, why am I not doing that? And then quickly got over that immature impulse and thought, wow, this is really radically different and really exciting, because it shows that there is this huge pool of information that's being ignored, I think purposely, because just due to the nature of the newspaper industry, there was so much competition, there were so many different venues putting out information. And nowadays with books, you have publishers who, for the most part, there are some publishers that are, without restrictions, but for the most part, the major publications are restricting what information goes out to the general public. And it seems like there was a time in American history where the jaws of mental delusion weren't so clamped tight over the general public. So as you're reading some of these older newspapers, do you glean that maybe and I know that it's hard to make like a general statistical survey point from just reading newspapers, but does it seem like there's a higher level of intelligence from people in that era, just maybe compared to what you see on social media?
Oh, yeah, great question. After spending as many thousands of hours now that I have in newspapers, especially late 1800s or late 1700s, early 1800s primarily, but a lot of the 1800s in general, at this point I could say I've probably read more papers than just about anybody else, and the consciousness was definitely different, as weird as that is to say. Yeah. How people went about communicating and discussing these types of things was very, very different. It was almost second nature, especially when you get into like the Missouri and Mississippi and the southern states. The Northeast too is its own monster, just because the historical records, as far as newspapers, are the most ancient, at least in the perspective that I'm describing. Right, going back into the mid to late 1700s, you can still find plenty of good archive information on newspapers published then. But believe it or not, when it comes to kind of like my sweet spot as far as material, the Northeast is very it's rather difficult to find good material. And you would think, okay, well, we have a solid amount of correspondence and written record, the most in the Northeast, but you find the least information about archaeology, geological finds. It's actually, believe it or not, seems like it was far more under control. Whether that has anything to do with the English controlling a lot of the printing, which is certainly the case in the 1700s. I don't know, but it's where it really kind of opens up is the early 1800s to the mid 1800s. And again, why I mentioned the Missouri and Mississippi areas is that archaeological discoveries in that region were so incredible and numerous that it was just like second nature. I mean, the thing that as I've correlated, connecting the dots with the transitional periods between, the founding of America and the moving west, was that you have all these people that are new to the land, quote unquote, new to the land, at least farmers that are new to the land. Whereas you may have had a culture living in that region for hundreds of years that were well aware of these ancient structures and, respected them and didn't, dig into them or plow the land or whatever it may have been. But yeah, the way people wrote, the way people talked about these things was very, very drastically different than nowadays. People had to just move along and get work done. If there was something found on their property and if it at all interfered with their livelihood or was able to make them a buck, that was it. You can see that all these people were doing the best they can to survive. That was really the mindset, especially as you got farther and farther west. So getting the public involved was rare, unless there was money to be made, if that makes sense. A lot of these collectors, the Smithsonian's come on board around this time frame. But a lot of these antique, quote unquote, antique dealers, they dealt with European interests and they paid high dollar. So that was where the fortunate side of the equation would come in, was that if someone was sharing their finds with the public out of good faith, then you had a fantastic article that was very genuine. And there are hundreds and hundreds of those that I've shared over the years. And then you have ones where people are trying to make a buck, which you can't blame them. I mean, you're talking about some of these artifacts being sold for hundreds, if not thousands of dollars or more. And in this time period, that's a decade's salary, if not more.
Right.
But yeah, so that was again a long-winded answer. But yes, the discovery, the excitement, and all of those things were quite drastically different. And it was like you had mentioned, you had a lot of competition, and there was no overseeing body, so to say. Most papers were independent, although some may have been owned by a conglomerate, so to say, in the state, or they own several, or because each little county or city would have their own individual papers once they got to a big enough size. And you can't control all of that, and so the story had to get big enough to interest people from the northern states, the DC areas, the Smithsonian's, all of those peoples. And when you're talking the 1800s, we're looking at weeks, if not months, before someone can get out there and do some kind of damage control, so to say. So yeah, there's a lot that's slipping through the cracks. Like you said, the jaws were very loose in those times, and it took until about World War I before that all changed.
Yeah, things began to be sewn up, and that's a great observation you shared about the Northeast. Despite having some of the lengthiest, archive records, they're probably the least informative. And I would chalk that up just offhand to Harvard and Yale being kind of at the beginnings of these colonies, very clerical governments. So there's already this sort of like implied what you can and can't talk about
Hmm.
through that religious orientation.
Yeah.
And then,
If it questions the Bible, I mean, you can find a lot of good stuff about giants,
mm,
and you can find a lot of preachers and pastors talking about, that, supporting that stuff because it supported the Bible. But when they find something that kind of contradicts the Bible, whether it be out of place artifacts, as you and I have been discussing for some time, that's when the stuff would disappear. And that's why the farther west, and this is why I chose to start my Anomalous America series in the West, and Alaska, I felt was the best way to do that, because you're dealing with a state that when everyone hears the word Alaska, they think the tundra, they think snow, they think cold, they think ice, reindeer. And that I wanted to start my series showing you that only a few hundred years ago, Alaska was 100% the opposite of that. And that can kind of be the gateway to changing the way you look at America and history and what our past was really like. And that's led us to where I am today.
yeah, yeah. I would like to maybe start there. I know we just kind of gave a pretty good brief summary of who you are and what you do, but folks, do your homework. Analog's got tons of videos on his YouTube channel. He's done some great interviews with other podcasters, and they went over a lot of the introductory stuff. So we're not going to spend that much more time there. But yeah, very fascinating to learn about, the philosophy behind what you do. And I guess just to finish our intro section, like, do you have a sort of higher vision to what you're doing? Is it curiosity that's guiding you? Is it a sense of like, I know they're lying to us that's guiding you? Like, when you put your head down at night, like what's that like mission that you're kind of like keeping up with?
Yeah, as I get older, my views on history and consciousness, I think, have really matured, I guess, or aged in a way where I look at the world as it's all kind of a show playing out, and that I'm a bit of a character, an actor in my own drama. And when I see, you know, governments acting against the will of the people and blah, 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 whatever way, whatever conspiratorial lens you want to apply to it, I think it's all purposeful, and that life is a puzzle, a labyrinth, and that you're walking the maze, and the directions you turn and take dictate the future steps in your life, and the information and opinions and belief is a slippery slope, but the beliefs that you have that guides you in the steps and turns you make of the labyrinth of life contribute to kind of this hero's journey in a Joseph Campbell way, that we're all just living out our own individual journeys, and that these adversaries put in front of us, governments, again, whatever, royal families, bloodlines, blah, 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 that they're all part of that kind of juxtaposition to your journey, and that they're all serving a purpose. I don't get too caught up in like hate and negative emotions when it comes to those things. I think that you can't have light without day, and love without hate, and all of these things, so on and so forth, and they all serve their purpose. And what I'm trying to accomplish is that I don't really ever think of it too much like that. I just, as silly as it sounds, I look at myself more as an entertainer as I get older, that I'm just trying to provide information that will be entertaining, that people will enjoy hearing, and that it may spark them. Because no matter what, whatever I say, I don't want anyone to feel that I'm trying to convince them of any particular view. I'm just trying to light a fire inside of them for them to go out and start taking their own steps as far as information that they take in. And and opinions that they come to, and that realizing that you have to walk the walk, so to say, and that narrow is the path, and that
Mm.
everyone has to knock at the door on their own free volition and their free will to begin this journey.
Yeah.
That's really it. Yeah, I just try to, I don't know, silly as it sounds, kind of inspire people to
No, I love that. I mean,
have an interest.
I think we run the risk of sounding like, a cheap wooden sign a tacky wooden sign that you'd put on your wall, like inspire, but it really does
Yeah.
inspire me. And I gotta say, 3 or 4 years ago, my audience has probably heard me say this a dozen times, but 3 or 4 years ago, when I first was introduced to the Tartaria hypothesis, it really motivated me and inspired me to look into my own, backyard's history. Because it's like, all right, you guys are telling me some other civilization was here so many years ago. I'm sure I can find it somewhere. And sure enough, it set me off on this path of rediscovering all these stone rows, these stone structures, these dolmens, menhirs, standing stones, all these different structures that are classically studied as old world constructions. And here in the new world, outside of maybe Barry Fell and a handful of other authors, nobody really has tried to attempt to explain what these are or fit them into a historical paradigm. So that's where I get really excited with your research, because it seems to fit and gel with what I'm actually finding in the field. Massive, massive stone boulders. And if what archaeologists tell us about Native Americans is true, they definitely couldn't build these stone structures. If we listen to their own words, they don't claim to have built them. They say someone else built them. And when you get into what they say about those people, they call them giants. Now, this is something that I think may be kind of like I don't know, another distraction, right? Because as you pointed out, like the biblical reaffirming information was often pushed in front of things that disaffirmed the biblical narrative. So we
Mhm.
do have a little bit of parsing out to do where, like, for instance, there was this whole hullabaloo about Hebrew inscriptions on a mountain here in my home state of Connecticut. And in the 70s, some guys doing some serious research went up and determined that they were old inscriptions, but they were not ancient. It was modern Hebrew being inscribed into these stones, and probably in like the 1700s. So quite a while ago, but not out of the ordinary, not something like a lost tribe situation. But
Mhm.
there have been other cases or instances where supposed evidence to support this, exodus of people from the Middle East into North America. I've heard you say that it might be the opposite, right? That like the cultures we know as Egypt and the old like Babylonian, like maybe they came from North America after some sort of cataclysm, right? Like our whole transactional history of, oh, these people started here and then went here and then went here, it's all been kind of skewed, right? Like
Mm.
where should we start with this? Because I know your latest live stream, you went into the Phoenicians, and for me, they were kind of the first culture I was introduced to as far as seafaring, pre-Columbian, possible American tribes. But they're not alone. There are other groups that have been, speculated, and evidence has been found to support that they have made it to North and South America, maybe the older world. What do you think of that?
Yeah. And the thing with the biblical stories is that tend to lean more towards them being mythopoetical. Um, again, looking at myself as, kind of this as within, so without, that the all is in the all, and these stories are all within inside of me. And that ultimately they all go back to kind of this singular idea, this hero's journey, the consciousness taking human form, physical form, to experience all that we can experience here in this realm. But yeah, the idea of Babylon and Chaldea and all of these things. Well, when you dive into them deep enough, you'll find a Celtic root. Now, I hate to use the word Celtic, but I know you know what I mean. Um, and you mentioned Barry Fell. I mean, if you read Barry Fell and Conor McDarry side by side, you'll find that they're describing the same story fundamentally. And this goes back to the connections I've made that writers have been making, but again, using the medium that I am presenting, that the artifacts strongly correlate with what a lot of these writers who kind of fell into obscurity were saying 100, if not more years ago. You know, Anna Wilkes wrote a book in the late 1800s called Ireland, the Ur of the Chaldees, where she shows a lot of incredible evidence to say that Babylon and Chaldea were Ireland, and Scotland, and the UK. And when you study these ancient peoples and their oral traditions, almost all of them say they came from the West, whether it be the Finns, the Celts, the Gauls, the Berbers, the Basque, on and on and on. We came from the West. There was an event. Our old world was destroyed, and we came from the West. The oldest Egyptian stories say the same thing. The Red Lands is what they were called, the land of the red. You find a very similar narrative with the Red Lands in Celtic mythology as well. But yeah, America being the true old world, quote unquote. I don't want people to get hung up on that because I'm exploring this just from a kind of relatively modern explanation of what we understand as biblical localities and all of these things. I think, again,
Well, and
whether or not, go ahead, sorry.
sorry to interrupt you, but we got to keep in mind, and I'm sure you know this, and just to remind the audience, the world, the earth changes over periods of time. The what it looks like, the physical landscape is altered and shifted. We just had a small earthquake here last week, and huge earthquakes can lift, whole land masses and sink whole land masses. And you do a really great job on your channel of showing people how easy it is for a landscape to shift, right? Because I think we have this idea of like permanence, you know, and things like an entire city can easily become buried under layers of topsoil. A whole city can easily become submerged under relatively low water just off the coast and be completely forgotten about, right? Maybe, fishermen know here and there, but for the most part, there are relics all along the coastlines of North America and the Caribbean that are yet to be discovered.
Yeah. Yeah. It's definitely something I talk about a lot. You know, cataclysmic events can change the topography, overnight. I've done videos on the 1811 New Madrid event, 1812 New Madrid event, the comets and the volcanoes and the electrical phenomenon in the sky that were occurring, and these relationships that exist between the sun and the moon and the stars and comets, and that they let them be for signs, and that the stars and the comets and all of these things really are kind of like foreshadowing in a way, and that's why every culture held them to such high regard. And the, understanding the story that they were showing you was kind of a precursor again to events that would come in your life. And yeah, but the changing landscape is definitely one of my most commonly covered things when it comes to buried terrain, topography, buried forests. And like you were mentioning earlier, again, the standing stones and all of these kind of out of place artifacts, so to say, they exist all across the realm. And not just in America, but that's my focus right now. But yeah, going back to what I was mentioning about everyone migrating from the West, and like you were mentioning, I've said quite often that the Mississippi River, that the Gulf of Mexico, I did a lot of work with Narco Longo first brought us together as friends was that our research had overlapped quite drastically when it came to the Gulf of Mexico, and that I had been saying that it was the navel of the world after after the receding from, you know, the so-called Mount Meru, or the central pillar, and that the Mississippi River, kind of like an umbilical cord, was the original representation of Isis and the story of Queen Mu, and the fleeing of the Gulf after a cataclysm or a coming cataclysm and heading to the Mediterranean. I've shown that there are statistical anomalies, geographical anomalies that exist between the Nile River and the Mississippi River, the Mediterranean and the Gulf of Mexico, that show, in my opinion, they are just mirrors of one another flipped. There are hundreds of anomalies, mathematical anomalies that exist between the two, that for me, they're kind of like a as above, so below, so to say, representation of human form and human psyche, and that the world we inhabit is kind of a mixture of both of those things, kind of a holographic representation of not only human form but human consciousness in landscape and topography.
Yes.
So that's kind of far out there, and maybe we'll save that
No,
for
I
another talk.
honestly, and it fits really well. I don't want to go all over the place here with this conversation, but it probably will feel a little bit like that for the audience, because I'm just brimming with ideas over here, and you're a fire. You're just a fire, a hot fire. You're inspiring me. So when it comes to this holographic symmetry of consciousness, human form, and then the earth itself, there's so many ways to think about that, but I love the way you juxtapose it. I don't know if you're familiar with Peter Shampoo's work, but he's done these really amazing measurements that I think it would fit perfectly with what you just said. And he's found that the Nile River and the Mississippi River, to your point, are mirrored like that, and they each have a relationship respectively with the sun and the moon. I think that's what he's determined. So maybe one of them is more solar, one is more lunar. Mississippi seems more lunar to me, but that's just off the top of my head saying that. But I wonder if humans, you know, it's not so much that we're given like this perfect nest, right? Maybe there's a part of that that's true, but like that we gravitate towards rivers like that, you know, inherently reflect this as above, so below holographic golden symmetry that all life, even on the largest scales, conforms to. We just naturally gravitate towards like the life affirming qualities, I guess, is a very roundabout way of saying it.
Yeah, and I've talked about this a lot, and I've made videos on the idea that the Noah's Ark story is a literal as well as mythopoetical story of the movement from masculine to feminine. So the movement from the Gulf of Mexico through some kind of event, whether you could think of that as the fractioning of consciousness. I bring a lot of Julian Jaynes' work. Are you familiar with Julian Jaynes? The breakdown of the bicameral mind. Basically, he just describes that consciousness took a drastic turn and separated. And that I think this Noah's Ark story, right? Noah and the Ark is the mind. Boats are always designed in the language of being a captain and faring the sea, and all of these things are obvious overlays with consciousness and the mind and all of these things, and that the migration from west to east was a consciousness shift, and as well as a perhaps literal event. And that so there's a story in Italy that Noah landed on an island in Italy, and that he came from the west, and that I juxtaposed Italy with Florida and the overlays. Me and Longo again did a video on this already, between Italy and Florida. This relates a lot to, again, tying this all back to Ireland the Great, that the Etruscan historical narrative of Italy is quite important, and it's been buried and covered up, just like the Gaelic and Irish history, and how Etruscan and Gaelic and Irish history are one and the same, and that the burying of these traditions goes along with this whole thing, and that, again, kind of wrapping it up in a consciousness perspective, that it's kind of this unveiling, and it's our job to realize that it all comes from a common source. Ultimately, that's what I correlate it all to. And yeah, that there's a cyclical mechanism to it all.
Right.
You talked about burying of cities, and it's happened over and over and over. Many cultures talk about 3, 4, 5, some even go up to 7 ages. And yeah, we're in a period where we're, it's like a new batch of plants, of fungi, however you want to look at it, growing and experiencing, and consciousness expanding, and then there'll be another cleaning of the slate, and fresh growth will start again.
Let's sit with the bicameral mind idea just for a moment, because it comes
Sure.
it comes to us around the same time that we have these. I would say after 10 years of knowing psychedelics and psychedelic users fairly well, there are some sort of slipshod theories about mushrooms maybe turning the stoned ape into a human, right? I don't buy into any of those ideas. And I find, as a conspiracy theorist, it's interesting that those came up around the same time that the bicameral mind theory came up. Maybe that's a different conversation. But when it comes to the bicameral mind, correct me if I'm wrong, but the thought is that ancient man, or whatever our consciousness was like before we have, let's call it, a modern consciousness, it was we had a different relationship with our inner monologue. Our inner monologue spoke to us almost the same way we would hear like a parent speak to us as a child, right?
Mm-hmm.
It was very much a guiding force, but we weren't actively thinking the same way our modern mind is now with, let's say, our will. We had a will, but it was sort of guided by this conscious. I mean, it's a conscious, but we didn't have a sort of full connection with it. It's almost like we were, the womb of our mind, like we were leaving the womb of our mind to be born into like a mental life where we're standing upright as an individual in our mental world, rather than being in this kind of collective consciousness phase of our mental world. And I wonder if it wasn't, to your point, really brilliant, like a dietary change, or like a consumption of something all alien like psychedelics, but rather a cataclysm that caused this group consciousness to split. We have the story of the Tower of Babel. We have the story of these gods that once came and taught us things, and now they left us on our own to our own devices. What if these are metaphors for this like group mind, which is clearly a reality for certain forms of life? Smaller forms of life tend to think in group mind, fish, insects, but larger forms of life like the dolphin, they can project a thought onto a seashell, and then another dolphin will swim by, and that thought will reflect back into their mind. So there are, and obviously we could debate psychic phenomenon, whether that means humans are in a group mind of sorts. But along those lines, do you think that this is maybe a helpful, maybe scaffolding to really re-understand history? Because I think that like consciousness seems to be at the crux of what stirred you up in your curiosity, and it feels like today's historians, they're divorced of any sense of that holistic view of things, where you take into account something like the consciousness of the person in the time period. You get where
Mm-hmm.
I'm kind of aiming at here?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, most of Julian's, and for those listening out there, Julian Jaynes and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind is the book that we're discussing, and his theories were a crackpot and he didn't get any credit. But over the last, 30 years or so, even longer, most of his theories have been pretty well damn proven. And he goes as far as saying that the Adam and Eve story is the separation of the bicameral state, and that leaving the garden, the so-called golden age, the Subterranean golden age, which I connect with the vapor canopy, the time before the sun and the moon and the stars existed, where man lived in this realm of giant trees that covered the sky, and he lived under a vaporous canopy, a permanent tropical climate that covered the entire realm, that fell relatively recently, not millions of years or hundreds of thousands of years. I don't play with those timelines, maybe 1,000 years at the most. And that, again, we could go off so many tangents just there: giant trees, giant animals, megafauna, higher atmospheric pressure, higher oxygen, blah, 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 blah. But yes, his theory again is that Adam and Eve ate of the fruit of knowledge, consciousness, imagination was born. And with imagination comes inner dialogue, inner monologue, and that they exited the garden, and that the Adam and Eve are your bicameral states of mind, the masculine, feminine, consciousness, subconscious. Subconscious being feminine, conscious being masculine, and that they exited the garden naked. So they were in the garden where there was peace and happiness and everyone got along because there was no inner dialogue. There was no self. You were one and the same. You were the tree, you were the rock, you were the person, you were the fish. That was the Garden of Eden. And you didn't need clothes because there was no identity. There was no self identity. There was no separation that comes with this. And that was the burden, so to say. And anyone that has struggled in life with hardship, this world is full of strife, and it's up to you. That's the transmutation of the alchemists of old, is transmuting these leadened emotional states into gold enlightened states. And that your journey of consciousness is, again, that Joseph Campbell reference is so powerful. And having these kind of overlapping authors to kind of bring material in and out of relationship is really important for people. But yeah, anyone that's interested in these topics, I strongly recommend his book. It's groundbreaking for me, and I really think it's closed a lot of holes in my retelling, so to say, of historical events in our past.
And it can help shed light, I think, with the right grounding in research of actual history divorced from myth, if we can even do that. Because kind of where I'm aiming at here is like, it seems like a lot of the myth that was generated in the original cultures of the old worlds were very holistic and life affirming. And then after this separation, people began to create stories for selfish reasons. And that's when we see history become skewed for political reasons, for religious dogmatic reasons, for just straight up, egotistical reasons, where you have a tyrant who does something or another. And maybe there's a higher order of reasoning behind why those people do what we call quote unquote bad or immoral things. But similar to how you described the roles earlier, right? Like, you don't look at the elite as evil or to be squashed from their throne. No, they're playing a role. This is how the universe is formed. It all fits in this kind of equanimity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one just need a rudimentary understanding of astrotheology and all of these stories that are ancient to see how we're all pieces of the whole, and that there's beauty in all things, even unfortunate circumstances. Again, why I was mentioning the kind of alchemical understanding that not only is there a literal alchemical transmutation process that's understood when it comes to chemistry and so on and so forth, that there's a there's a metaphorical transmutation that goes along with the chemicals. Again, this mirroring of worlds. Um, yeah, and it's an important subject. I think I'm not the only one, but there are few and far between when it comes to being able to discuss the burying of past empires, but also in the same sentence talk about how this kind of is a consciousness story, uh, kind of unraveling, so to say.
Right.
And I know I lose some people there, but um, yeah, it's just kind of again
Well,
my own lens on things.
no, I think that is the more human lens, and maybe the reason why you lose people is because so many of us, myself included, at a certain point in my life, became indoctrinated into this material worldview that is very much predicated on a view of the world divorced from our origins, divorced from this more holistic understanding of how all life fits together. So yeah, I think a lot of people are coming from, coming to these topics on maybe uneven ground, and they need to kind of do their own great reset. But on that note, I want to go back to Alaska, especially after what you said about the vapor canopy and the megafauna, because Alaska seems like a place where I wouldn't call polar bears megafauna, but they're as mega as it gets for North America, right? I mean, they're the biggest predator in the world, I believe, as far as land animals go. Um, and we have also rumors and even newspaper articles of woolly mammoths not being found like, frozen in ice like they tell us, but rather walking, living, threatening people with their mighty tusks. So something like a woolly mammoth quite possibly could have been stomping around, only a couple decades ago, if not still alive today. Um, where do we start with Alaska? Because I've heard you say there's pyramids, there's giants, there's Scythian burial grounds there. Is Alaska maybe a place where we can learn about this vapor canopy because it's so close to the North Pole? Like, are there aspects to Alaska that maybe reveal things about this previous time before whatever cataclysm upset that?
Yeah, Alaska hides a lot. Again, the ice and the snow, the permafrost really do a great job. Nature always does the best job of concealing the past. One only need to look at the Amazon and see that it doesn't take very much time to cover what could be the largest city states in all of the realm in thousands of miles of tropical forest. It doesn't take much time. And the same goes for Alaska. Um, what lies beneath the snow there is a treasure trove. All along the coast of Alaska is tropical coral reefs. Um, these have been written about again from the late 1800s. They've been dived. It's hard to find a lot of good video and documented information after World War II. But this brings us into episode 1 of my Anomalous America series, and like I had mentioned to you earlier, why I wanted to start there was because so much is flipped. The coin is completely turned with Alaska, and like you mentioned with animals, I kind of describe these events as kind of changeover events. There are smaller versions and there are larger versions. How and when and all of that, I would be lying if I said I knew the exact dates. I certainly don't, but there were definitely creatures that survived these changeover events. And one of the main articles I cover in my Anomalous America series of Alaska is the one called the Giant Saurian of the Arctic. And basically, they fight with what they called a hairy lizard, essentially. It was as big as 10 elephants.
A
And
hairy elephant as big as 10 elephants. Jesus Christ. We're
hairy,
talking
a
about the
hairy
size of
lizard.
like a
Yeah.
Boeing.
They described it as a lizard. They
Oh,
called it a
lizard,
saurian.
lizard.
Yeah, a giant saurian.
Wow.
The natives all knew about it, and the stories actually even cross across the Aleutians into northern Siberia. The Siberians told the same story and described this exact same creature. In fact, they said that it hibernates underground for years at a time, and that they believe perhaps this was again the Aleutian chain being much larger than it is today, and that they were crossing between the Siberian side and the Alaskan side more freely. But the Siberians said that it lived in caves underground and it came out to eat. There are several articles about this, and you can find not a lot, but a pretty good amount of information, because what made this article so special is that the Duke of Westminster traveled from Europe to hunt this. So big game hunting is another thing that I touch on a lot. All of these kind of aristocrats, big game hunting was really, really huge. And they were all traveling the world hunting these exotic animals that had survived this kind of event. And that this was one of these animals, and that the Duke of Westminster traveled all the way to Alaska. Now, that's no easy journey. That's several months, I think. I can't remember the exact amount of time in the 1800s, the late 1800s. And I'll just do a quick little, I'll just read you a small little excerpt here. As big as 10 elephants, it passed like a hurricane across the frozen river, smashing immense blocks of ice and kicking them into the air. Its long bristles were covered with frost, and its immense red eyes flamed in the twilight. The monster held in its mouth a caribou of close to 700 pounds, while it careened at about 20 miles an hour. The gigantic prehistoric creature that is now again exciting Russian sportsmen and scientists, along with the discovery of an unsuspected mountain range in northeastern Siberia, which may be its home. So again, anyone can, in my videos, I give you a link to my Twitter page where I make a thread of all these newspaper articles, and you can just click on it in the description and you can see all these articles. Excuse me. Another one that I touch on is the tropical nature of Alaska before this event happened that turned it into a polar region. Alaska used to be covered in palm trees, huge tropical foliage, freshwater rivers that were full of tropical life. The whole state was tropical. And I'll read you a little excerpt here. Tropical valley found in Alaska. Subterranean fires keep district warm. So this is a really special one. There's actually two other versions of this found. These people that were out looking for mining claims, prospecting, came across, imagine hiking through the tundra, snow, barren wasteland, snow, trees, and coming across a tropical forest. And that's what they found. They found that there were subterranean fires, whether it was coal fires or volcanic, they weren't sure. But in this, what they described as a few hundred acres were a subterranean forest. So you're walking through the snow, and then you come to this Eden in the middle of nowhere, Alaska. And basically what they described is that a subterranean fire kept this district warm. And they stumbled into a broad valley where mammoth trees, beautiful flowers, and wild game abound. Due to the warmth from the subterranean fires, that the men first believed they had been transported into some tropical climate. Thousands of wildflowers carpeted the lush grass, and every kind of game was seen. The trees included cottonwood, spruce, and hemlock. Anyways, this is one of many when it comes to just describing the tropical history of Alaska. They find lizards, snakes, every kind of tropical birds, tropical plants. Again, I mentioned palms. But the crazy thing too is that they find massive coconuts. I mean, coconuts from palm trees that would have been 100 feet, 200 feet tall, maybe larger.
Yeah.
So not only are they finding large megafauna as far as, massive ferns, like massive ferns, they're finding massive animals. They're finding all this stuff, again, nodding not only to a climate where, again, as I mentioned, with the vapor canopy, higher pressure, kind of that barometric pressure idea that with pressure comes more oxygen, right? That everything will get larger, vegetation, animals, blah blah blah.
Right. Wow, and that's incredible. I mean, for people not as nerdy as me when it comes to animals and biology, that's not far fetched at all. Very often, you find microclimates of species that only exist in a very, very, very specific type of environment. And subterranean, geothermal current of warmth, keeping this otherwise, tundra area warm. Yeah, maybe it preserves all of these indigenous, species that were once in a tropical Alaska. Do you think that the vapor canopy had something to do with the temperature change and the maybe?
Yes.
So yeah, let's get into that because the whole north and south poles we're told are cold and the earth has always been like this, or used to be much warmer. The what do you call them, paleontologists, well, they'll admit that, oh yeah, millions and millions of years ago the dinosaurs lived in a world that had no ice, right? They don't
Mm.
mention where the ice was before, how it got, like they just seem to say it came from the ocean or something. But this vapor canopy idea, it's mentioned not just in the Bible, it's mentioned in other old world religions, this idea that there were aspects to our atmosphere that are different than what modern people see in the sky. I even had a conversation with someone recently about a whole class of living creatures that live up in this upper atmosphere, where once you get past a certain altitude it becomes warmer, and then it becomes more moist, and then it becomes basically like water. So maybe there even is remnants of a water canopy still up there today. What,
Mm.
where do we begin with this topic?
Yeah, it's a big one. But again, kind of correlating again with Eden, the fall of Eden, the exiting of Eden, I correlate with the fall of the vapor canopy. When you talk about Adam and Eve being in a tropical world, this climate is the same. You find that the temperature was nearly identical in the equatorial regions as it was in Alaska. Same with